I don't think therapy speak became popular because people got wiser. I think it became popular because plain honesty started to feel too naked. It is weirdly hard to say simple things now. Harder than it should be. Hard to say I missed you more than I wanted to admit. Hard to say I was jealous. Hard to say I wanted reassurance and felt stupid for needing it. Hard to say you hurt my feelings and I have been pretending I'm above it. Those are small sentences. Human sentences. But they expose too much. So instead, people reach for something cleaner, more structured, more impressive. Something that sounds less like a confession and more like an assessment. That is where therapy speak enters the room. It started as a tool, then it became a costume. Not everyone using this language is being fake. Not always. Not every person reaching for words like boundaries, gaslighting, triggered, narcissist, avoidant, or trauma bond is trying to manipulate somebody. Sometimes people are genuinely trying to understand what happened to them. Sometimes a word arrives and suddenly, years of confusion collapse into something that finally makes sense. Sometimes language really does save people from decades of self-blame. But once that language leaves therapy and enters the internet, something changes. It stops sounding like a tool and starts sounding like a costume. And the terrifying part is that it is an extraordinarily convincing one. Because therapy speak gives you two things at once. It lets you sound hurt and superior, vulnerable but never helpless. It lets you describe your pain without having to sit too long inside the actual mess of it. It gives your feelings a polished frame. And once your feelings are framed that way, they start to sound unquestionable. That is why so many modern conversations sound emotionally intelligent, while feeling emotionally dead. You can hear the substitution everywhere once you start noticing it. A person doesn't say, "I think I'm overwhelmed by your emotions, and I don't know how to hold them." They say, "You're trauma dumping." A person doesn't say, "I want out of this relationship, and I don't want to feel guilty about it." They say, "I'm protecting my peace." A person doesn't say, "I feel deeply destabilized when you deny what I remember." They say, "You're gaslighting me." A person doesn't say, "I think I am trying to control this situation because I'm scared." They say, "This is my boundary." And maybe, sometimes those words are accurate. Some people truly are manipulative. Some people genuinely need distance. Real abuse exists. Real psychological harm exists. Pretending otherwise would be naive and even cruel. But the problem is that now the diagnosis often arrives before the description. Before we explain what happened, we label it. Before we understand the pattern, we declare the verdict. Before we ask what we actually felt, we decide what the other person is. And once that happens, curiosity disappears. Curiosity is the real loss here, not precision. That, to me, is the deepest wound in all of this. Not that we are losing precision, that we are losing curiosity. Because curiosity is what makes relationships human. Curiosity is what says, maybe I'm right, but I want to understand before I punish. Maybe I'm hurt, but I don't want to label more than I want the truth. Curiosity is what keeps you in the room long enough to find out whether the other person is dangerous or just disappointing, or just deeply human in ways that happen to grind against your own humanity. That kind of thinking is slower, less dramatic, less viral, but it is considerably closer to actual life. Real life is often humiliatingly unspectacular. Your ex may not have been a narcissist. They may have just been selfish, immature, and fundamentally inconsistent. Your friend may not have violated your boundaries. They may have just disappointed you in a way you don't know how to forgive yet. Your partner may not be gaslighting you. They may be defensive, ashamed, and stubbornly committed to their own version of events. Your boss may not be toxic in some cinematic, diagnosable way. They may just benefit from a workplace that quietly drains everyone and calls it professionalism. But those explanations feel less satisfying. They don't give you clean emotional closure. They do something worse. They force you to stay near the ambiguity. They force you to admit that a person can hurt you without being evil, that you can be genuinely damaged by someone who is not clinically anything, just careless, that you can deeply suffer in a relationship that does not qualify as abuse, but still slowly shrinks you, and that you can also misuse the language of healing while believing you are the healthiest person in the room. That last part is the most uncomfortable one, and I think it is the most important. A lot of therapy speak is not used by cruel people. It is used by ordinary people who are scared of looking ordinary in their pain. We do not want to sound needy. We do not want to sound petty, clingy, jealous, dependent, bitter, or just plainly heartbroken. Those words feel low status. They feel embarrassing in a way that is almost social, so we upgrade them. We translate raw feeling into a more official dialect. Instead of saying I was desperate for them to choose me, we say I have an anxious attachment style. Instead of saying I was controlling because I felt unsafe and small, we say I was enforcing my boundaries. Instead of saying I'm still obsessed with what happened and I hate that I care this much, we say I'm processing trauma. Instead of saying I can't stop replaying the breakup because my ego is shattered, we say I'm healing from narcissistic abuse. And again, sometimes those stronger interpretations are genuinely, precisely true. But sometimes they are not. Sometimes they are just more flattering than the plain version. And the plain version is almost always where the real work begins. Because healing is not, at its core, about acquiring better vocabulary for your damage. Healing is becoming less afraid of accurate language. Not dramatic language. Not impressive language. Accurate language. There is a significant difference between saying, I was triggered, and saying I felt embarrassed, abandoned, and suddenly 10 years old again. The second sentence is messier, less portable, considerably harder to turn into shareable content. But it tells the truth in a way the first sentence often quietly avoids. The first sentence may be technically correct. The second sentence reveals your actual interior. And that interior is where real change happens. This is why therapy speak so frequently feels strange, even cold, in real conversations. It often sounds like a person has skipped over the vulnerable middle and jumped straight to the polished conclusion. They sound finished before they sound honest. They sound interpreted before they sound felt. And people can sense that gap even when they cannot name it. That is why even genuinely good language starts to feel hollow, in the wrong mouth. Not because the words themselves are bad, but because they can be used to bypass what I think of as the trembling part of being known. The trembling part is what relationships actually require. Not expertise. Not a well-curated framework. Not perfect emotional branding. Trembling. The willingness to say, I don't know if I'm making sense, but this hurt me. The willingness to say, part of me wants to call you toxic because it would make leaving easier. The willingness to say, I may be calling this a boundary, but if I'm really honest, I think I want control because I'm terrified. That is the kind of honesty people remember long after the conversation ends. Not because it sounds sophisticated, but because it sounds alive. The most honest people I know pause when they talk about pain. They correct themselves mid-sentence. They admit uncertainty out loud. They say things like, I don't know if this is the right word, but something about that felt deeply wrong. Or I'm still sorting out what was mine and what was theirs. Or maybe I'm overstating it, but I do know I wasn't okay in that relationship. There is humility in that kind of speech. There is breadth in it. There is room for reality to be more complicated than the speaker's first interpretation. And I trust it far more than the person who arrives at every emotional conversation with a complete, polished diagnosis already assembled. I trust the person who can describe before they diagnose. I trust the person who can say what happened before they tell me what category it belongs to. I trust the person who is still visibly trying to tell the truth, rather than trying to win the story. So maybe the answer is not to abandon therapy language entirely. Some of these words matter enormously. Some of them gave people a map out of real confusion. Some of them help people name abuse that previous generations had absolutely no language for. Some of them saved lives, and that is not a small thing. The problem is not the map. The problem is that too many people now want the map without the journey. They want the language of insight without the actual discipline of insight. They want the label without the observation. They want the authority of therapy without the vulnerability that therapy is supposed to demand. And that is how words become performance.
Performance always wants to appear coherent. Real growth can admit contradiction. Performance says, I know exactly what you are. Real growth says, I know what this did to me, and I'm still learning how to name the rest. Performance wants a villain. Real growth can survive disappointment without needing to turn it into a personality disorder. Performance wants to sound evolved. Real growth is often embarrassing. So maybe the answer is stranger and simpler than we expect. Before you use the big word, say the small human sentence first. Before you say boundary, say what you are actually afraid of. Before you say triggered, say what memory or feeling came alive in you. Before you say gaslighting, describe the exact pattern you observed. Before you say narcissist, ask whether selfish, dishonest, shallow, or cruel might already be sufficient and more honest. Before you say protecting my peace, ask whether you are truly protecting peace or protecting your image. Before you say trauma response, ask what the experience actually felt, like in your body, in your chest, in your thoughts, in your shame. Say the human sentence first, because if the bigger term still fits after that, it is probably real. And if it falls apart after that, maybe what you needed was not a diagnosis. Maybe what you needed was courage. That, to me, is the real dividing line. Not between healthy and unhealthy people, not between healed and unhealed people, but between people who use language to get closer to reality and people who use language to get farther away from it. A good word should bring you nearer to your life, nearer to your motives, nearer to your grief, nearer to your actual responsibility, nearer to what genuinely happened. The moment a word makes you feel cleaner than the truth, probably warrants, be careful, because maybe that word is helping you, but maybe it is hiding you. And if there is one paradox that matters most in all of this, it is this one. The goal was never to sound more therapeutic. The goal is to become more reachable, not more diagnostic, more honest, not more polished, more real. Because in the end, people do not heal by learning better language. They heal when the language stops being a shield and becomes a door. The trembling, imprecise, embarrassingly human kind of door. That is the one worth walking through.